While they're coming in, I just want to say a few things about this panel, because it's really an all-star panel, the best that I can think of to tackle this subject. Michael Pettis, on my far left here, is a former investment banker. He is professor of finance at Peking University's Guanghua School of Management, author of several books about the Chinese economy, and also known as the godfather of Beijing's indie rock scene. Many of you will know that. David Daokui is an old friend, known him for many years. He is born in Sichuan. He was a star scholar as a student. He was one of the inaugural class of the 1985, is that right? Tsinghua School of Economic and Management's first graduating class. He went to Harvard, where he earned his PhD in economics in 1992. He was a professor at the University of Michigan in economics and was wooed by Tsinghua, his alma mater, to return to China, where he has become a professor of economics. He is also the director of the Center for China and the World Economy, and he is the director of the newly created Schwarzman Scholars Program, which is quite a thing. He also happens to be a member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the People's Bank of China, so pretty well versed in China's economy. And of course, on my left, Wei-Sun Christianson, who is the CEO of China and CEO of Asia Pacific for Morgan Stanley, where she's worked since 1998, if I'm not mistaken. She's a lawyer by training with a degree from Columbia University, and she's really one of the most accomplished figures in Asian investment banking. She's been involved with some of the biggest China deals that have been done, and we're really quite fortunate to be able to have the three of them here today. Well, so let's dive right in and talk about where China's economy is. And Michael, I'm going to start with you. You heard at the top the IMF's strong projection for China's outlook. We've heard here in the last several days a lot of upbeat sentiment about China's prospects. We've seen some amazing entrepreneurs that have shown that innovation is taking place here at a pretty remarkable clip in China. We heard from the vice premier that China intends to be open and it is welcoming foreign trade and investment. We heard from Jack Ma that he is very bullish about China's future, and we heard this morning from some Western investors who are equally confident and putting their money into China. My question is that view warranted or is it overdone? You've warned that we systematically misinterpret the information that's provided by Beijing's GDP forecasts. And so my first question to you is, what's wrong with 6.7 GDP and what doesn't it tell us?
Well, when you look at the GDP growth rate for most countries, for the US, for the UK, Brazil, whatever, the GDP data represents an output, a systems output, in the sense that the economy does whatever it is going to do, and then in an attempt to measure the performance of the economy, you measure certain things that we've agreed to measure when we calculate GDP. But in China, that's not the case. GDP is not an output, it's an input into the system. And what happens is that local governments are then encouraged to borrow however much is necessary in order to generate that GDP growth number. It's an astonishingly stable number, more stable than Switzerland. And so as a result, I think we have to look at it very, very differently. It doesn't tell us what's happening in the economy. We already know what GDP is going to be in any given quarter. What we need to do is to look at how much debt did it take to get us from whatever the real growth rate would have been, which I suspect is less than half the reported growth rate, to that level of GDP growth, which is a measure of economic activity. It's not a measure of value creation.
So I just want to highlight that, because in your estimate, the actual real kind of growth rate, if China were forced to sort of mark to market the value of all this debt that it has taken on, would be closer to 3% rather than this 6.7 that we're
Absolutely,
talking
and that mark to market is a key point, because when you calculate GDP, and the value added component of GDP is the profitability of the business sector. So if companies are forced, or banks are forced to market their debt, that reduces the profitability, and then it reduces the GDP report.
So just very quickly, we've heard from a number of people over the course of the last few days that China's growth still has many years left to run. And yet you've suggested that perhaps China's growth has already peaked. Can you tell us why?
Well, partly it's the historical precedents. You know, this investment-driven growth miracle, there's nothing new about it. Danny Roderick says there are at least 24 decade-long investment growth miracles since the Second World War. What's interesting to me is that every one of them has ended in a terrible adjustment. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that China cannot be the one historical exception. But if you look at all of the factors that led to that difficult adjustment, they're all there. The difference between China and the precedents is that we've never seen the imbalances taken to such deep levels. We've never seen debt taken to such a high level or to grow so quickly. So what's happened in every other case is that there is an adjustment. Either you have a crisis, which actually doesn't happen in most cases. In some cases, you have a debt crisis. But in most cases, you didn't really have a debt crisis. You simply had a point at which either they no longer wanted to or they were no longer able to allow debt to continue growing at such a rapid pace. And whenever that's happened, growth rates have collapsed far more than even the pessimists predicted.
So you get kind of lost decades like in the case of Japan.
Like Japan.
All right, David, reassure us that Michael is wrong.
Okay, Michael, first of all, a pleasure for me to come here. Michael and I go back. We have been engaged in many debates, so he doesn't have to talk. I know already what's going on here, okay? So let me go back. Two things. Number one, what is GDP? Well, very simple. GDP is not about corporate value added. GDP is how people are, how busy they are with economic activities, not with political ones.
Right.
A campaign, an election is not GDP, right? When you are busy building bridges, when you are busy building roads, when you are busy building factories, that's GDP.
Yeah.
That's why GDP is important, because policymakers do want people to be busy with the economic things, not with the political things.
Okay.
Right? Occupy the biological energy.
All right.
Right? That's what they are. Okay. Therefore, social stability. Okay. Right. So measuring by that standard. Okay. Then the GDP growth is for real. Never in other countries you see so many new buildings, new railroads being built. A 3% growth in the U.S. In the U.S., New York City, you don't see so many new buildings. You don't see so many new bridges. That's 3%.
Absolutely.
Here is 7%. Okay. That's first thing. Second thing about debt. Well, the debt should not be discussed by itself. The debt should be discussed together with how much savings that people are willing to put aside, because the source of debt is saving. Savings and debt should be matched. In Japan, for example, high savings rates, and their debt is 350% of GDP.
Yeah.
China is 250% GDP, much lower than Japan. So for the sake of argument, I argue that China should actually increase debt, because the savings are too high. The savings are now going to the U.S., financing President Trump's budget cuts, right?
Right.
So the debt should come back. Money should come back to finance Chinese more debt, right? So my second point is that the debt level is not nearly as high as the limit, because the savings rate is around 40%, 2 to 3 times of the savings rate of the U.S. Okay. Therefore, the growth is sustainable.
So let me just ask you quickly, though. You know, this point of sort of marking to market and trying to assess whether the loans, the debt is actually going into something that adds to productivity or doesn't. It's almost impossible for us to know in the present.
Well, actually, it's very simple, specific here. I should mention that in the past 4 or 5 years, because there's the anti-corruption campaign, right, which is good in the long run. But in the short run, officials in position were scared. They were scared that maybe in history they had improper dealing with private entrepreneurs. So they were hiding. They were not aggressive. And therefore, growth rates slows down because private investments are not forthcoming. As a consequence, in order to stabilize the economy, the central government called upon infrastructure investments, which required proportionally more upon official or formal debt. Right? That's the reason for the rapid increase of debt. Now things are turning around. 19th Party Congress. 19th Party Congress means that provincial and the municipal governments have already been replaced, including our one. You know, you saw him yesterday, right? You saw him yesterday, right? I just arrived here. I think he already appeared in the podium, right? In the stage, right? Mr. Ren, new. But so Mr. Ren, before coming here, he was carefully studied or examined by the party's Department of Organization or HR department. So he was cleared to be cleared. So he's not scared of being investigated for the past behavior. He was giving a proper physical checkup. From now on, private investment will pick up.
Okay.
Number prediction.
Wait, the 19th Party Congress, does it make you more reassured about China's economic prospects? What's the view from Wall Street and from your standpoint?
Well, it's an honor to be part of this heated debate. And I think first thing first is that a lot of investors, when we travel, ask about the financial shock, because when China is focusing on deleveraging,
right,
and people are really worried and saying what's going to happen, right, when you clean up the financial sector, etc. And actually, we think that risk is actually quite limited, because as you start to talk with the regulators and the decision makers, they start to focus on really to do it in a measured pace. So this means when new regulations are coming out and they're going to regulate certain behaviors, right, of participants in the financial market or capital market, there will be consultation period.
Right.
There will be also grace period, which is very important. And I agree with these two, I agree with Mr. Lee, Professor Lee. I think the government will continue curtailing the provincial investments, and in particular the NDRC is going to scrutinize and review this various kind of project like PPP, which is very popular, and also metro line investments. Right. This approval process to make sure there is no financial loopholes. If so, they want to fix that, and that's a good thing. But that doesn't mean that there will be no projects coming from a province, like the Xiong'an projects, like the Big Bay Area projects, anything related to Belt and Road, no doubt will receive great support from government.
Huh. We've seen a little bit of a pullback in terms of the government's willingness to allow Chinese companies to make deals and send capital for investment overseas. Do you think that's a permanent shift, or is that a temporary pullback?
We don't think it's permanent, but if you look at the volume of the MA cross-border transactions in China was staggering. In 2015,
big run-up, yeah.
Yeah. And the number reached 100 billion, and we said, oh, this must be the peak. Yeah. But it doubled in 2016. But the government actually has this reason to really start to provide some guidelines, to provide more supervision of the type of transactions they're doing. You got to be strategic. There has to be, the future success post the deal needs to be examined instead of just money going out buying anything that is available. And the negative list they published is also helpful. But what's interesting is that actually, even though 2017, the MA volume dropped about 44%, you still see huge interest from the big corporates in terms of cross-border
investment. This is the drop is the 40% drop is outbound investment. Is that right?
It's outbound, and these interests are very much focused on new economy. And this is supported by the government, the healthcare, education, etc., and technology, of course. So therefore, over the longer run, I think the government will change. For the time being, there is concerns, many concerns, as you know, but it's not a permanent phenomenon.
Okay, Michael, you probably wouldn't disagree with this notion that we're not in danger of any kind of immediate financial collapse. Is that correct?
I think it's very unlikely.
Very unlikely. But you have a different take on why that is, right?
Yeah, in fact, I want to come back. In the last couple of years, we've really heard again and again, how can China have a debt problem? It's all funded by domestic savings. And I'm bewildered by that. A debt problem funded by domestic savings is the definition of a debt problem in a current account surplus country. That's just how they happen. Take a look at the United States in the 1920s. The United States had a huge explosion of debt in the 1920s, and I think we all agree, a very difficult 1930s. But according to people who say that if the debt is funded domestically by savings, you can't have a debt problem, then it's impossible to explain what happened in the US, because more than 100% of the debt was funded domestically by American savings. What about Japan? In the 1980s, exactly the same thing. It was fully funded by domestic savings. Domestic savings were so high that it funded all of the Japanese debt plus foreign debt. Same thing in the US. So there's nothing surprising about that. But what ended up happening in the US is when you have this surge in debt and the possibility of a sudden stop, you get the adjustment in the form of a crisis. And if you don't have the possibility of a sudden stop, which I think is very unlikely in China, as long as the banking system is closed, then you have what Japan had. You have 2 lost decades of 0.5% growth. So China, the thing that really impresses me about China is not that somehow it's done it differently. What impresses me about China is that it's done it exactly the same way every other country that has had this problem has done it, with one exception, and that is the imbalances in China, as I said, are far deeper than anything we've ever seen before, and the growth rate in debt is the fastest we've ever seen. And China has the highest debt level for a developing country that we've ever seen. So those are the differences.
So, all right, so this touches on a really important point, because standard economic theory would suggest that one solution for China is actually not to remain closed, as you're suggesting that it will be, but to follow through with a lot of the assurances that we've heard from central government leaders here in the last couple of days, which is that China is determined to, the theme of this gathering, pursue openness, that it wants to liberalize to foreign trade, it wants to, make room for more of these kind of deals. So as a good well-trained economist, do you think that's a proper course of action for China to pursue? What would be the consequences of true opening for China?
Maybe luckily for me, I'm a finance guy, not an economist. But the set of reforms, I sort of associate them with the World Bank reforms in the China 2030 document that just came out very recently. And,
this is the IMF, the 2030 is the
World Bank.
World Bank.
The World Bank's, if you read through the entire document, it's truly astonishing. They think that China is going to grow at 6.6% on average for the next 20 years, which when you adjust for the growth of the working population and the subsequent decline of the working population, means that they think China is actually going to grow per capita more quickly in the next 20 years than in the last 30 years. And nowhere in the document is there any discussion of debt except it's a problem, but it's probably not going to be a problem because there probably won't be a crisis. And I think that's completely wrong. In fact, I find it really surprisingly wrong, because it seems to me that the reason China won't have a crisis is a balance sheet problem, right? It's an asset liability mismatch where you have some sort of liquidity event that makes it impossible to cross the liabilities. But in a closed banking system with highly credible regulators, and I think the regulators are quite credible, you can always restructure the liabilities. That's why China is very unlikely to have a crisis. So when they talk about opening up the banking system and liberalizing the banking system, that strikes me as potentially a recipe for disaster, because it means that we now open up the possibility for crisis within the financial sector. The other point that I would make is that if you look at the historical precedents, when you liberalize a highly indebted, highly distorted financial system, it doesn't tend to improve productivity. It tends to generate even more rapid growth in bad debt. The classic case is the S&L crisis in the United States in the 1970s and 80s. So I'm very worried about a lot of those reform proposals.
So I want to open it up to questions from the floor, but let me give you one quick question, David, and that's the other end of this liberalization question. What's going to happen with SOE reform? We heard a lot from the central government leaders about how they would pursue SOE reform, but I often think that what we hear when Chinese leaders say SOE reform and what they mean are quite different things. What we like to hear in the West is that means that SOEs are going to wither away, they're going to be privatized, their presence in the economy is going to be reduced. But it seems to me what they actually mean is we're going to strengthen SOEs. We don't mind if they continue to occupy a very large part of the GDP. We just want to consolidate them so that they're not on such shaky financial footing. Am I wrong?
Well, okay, there are 3 specific things that's actually going on. Number one, with SOEs. Number one, the government is now trying to go through an exercise to decide which SOEs should be totally privatized. These are commercially oriented SOEs, meaning that they are in competitive markets, right? Second job they are trying to do is to diversify the ownership of the remaining SOEs, meaning that introducing non-state shareholders, it's a mixed ownership, right? Third thing they're trying to do is to invite or attract professional managers to work in the ISOEs and pay them market price, market bonus, market salaries, let them work, right, as professional. Now let me very, very quickly go back to the issue of liberalization, right? Opening up meaning two things. One is to open up your financial services, or open up your competition. The other is to open up capital flow. These two things may not go hand in hand. What China will do, I think, in the coming decade, not only 5 years, is to open up financial services. Let Goldman Sachs have more than 51% of shares of certain commercial banks.
Just Goldman Sachs?
For example, or Morgan Stanley, okay? Okay.
We have our hands ready.
Yeah, so because the Chinese local financial service companies are now much more confident than 15 years ago when China was accessing WTO. But however, on the issue of capital flow, certain kind of control still should be and will be maintained, because otherwise, I agree with Michael, otherwise capital flow can be very tricky, can really undermine the economy.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about that? Are you lobbying hard for more than 51%?
Yeah, we just actually increased not long ago to 49%. So this 51% is great news. And I think this further indicates one thing that is a big takeaway from the 19th Party's Congress, and that is the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes.
There's so much talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. I think there are two things that are actually very interesting, at least to me. One is that it's actually a two-pronged initiative. It's going out and also bringing in. So opening up a domestic market gradually, but that is almost as important as going out. What we have seen so far, a lot of actions, global expansion, people think, you know, that's all about investing outside China. That's not right. So the question is that the pace of the opening up and the areas opening up, how they're going to open up. But I think for foreign participants like us, it's really important to have transparency and predictability and level playing field in the longer run. And also the second thing is that people focus on the political aspect of the Belt and Road. And this is China gaining influence, gaining soft power. But China is not the only country doing this. United States have been doing this for decades, but through aids and grant. But China is not bashful about its intention. Call this an investment, meaning there needs to be commercially viable opportunities. China also would like to have economic return on these investments. I think that's great news for the people of China and also the government, because with the foreign reserve, that it's not only help these membering countries, but also will help China's foreign reserve to gain some good return.
Very interesting. We've got just a few minutes left. We can take maybe one or two questions. I see a question here from Andy. Let me take this one and I'll come back to you, Andy. We get the red panel or the yellow panel and the microphone here. And if you could stand and tell us who you are, so we.
Tom McInerney, Genworth Financial US. I have a question for any of the panelists on the demographic changes coming in the next 20, 30 years in the aging society and the impact that you think that will have on the economy.
Sure.
So you want to, who wants to field that?
Well, the demographics certainly is changing, and I do think that's a big challenge. And the government is now trying to do some reforms in this regard. I think the biggest reform is how to utilize those aging, which we are doing, right? Yeah. Aging, and healthy bodies, healthy human capital.
Right.
Like in my university, we push people to retire at age 60, maybe Peking University for you.
That's a bad idea.
Okay, so from now on, I do believe in the near future, the retirement age will be pushed back so that the pension will be higher for those late retirees than early retirees. That, to me, is a big part of the solution.
I want to add about the business opportunities that we all know that healthcare, aged care will go hand in hand with this aging population. But this is actually encompasses a very broad range of services, and it's pharmaceutical, it's the hospital, specialized hospital, maternity, rehabilitation, and a lot of different areas. So huge opportunity. In addition, China has peaked in terms of labor force in 2010, and ever since 2010, the labor force supply has been shrinking. So that shrinking labor force have created this scenario. People say, China has people. and 才, China has a material, but China doesn't have a talent, 人才. So therefore, recently you see a very interesting phenomena. You know, this headhunting business have attracted a lot of great investment. We actually recently invested in a great headhunting firm, and not only the IPO was a great success, and the company is growing at amazing pace. So education is another area, because as China, you know, one-child policy and now two-child policy in place, people are totally focusing on K-12. So that is from kindergarten to 12th grades. Their education in school, good schools needs to be built. Quality of education needs to be focused. And not only that, you know, special tutoring service is very important. And lastly, also the agencies and training for kids to study abroad.
Okay, so lots of opportunities there. We got a minute and a half. Andy?
Okay, great. Andy Mock. So how's the shift to a consumption-led economy going, and are there any unexpected challenges that we should be paying attention to?
Shift to the consumption economy.
That's, I think, the brightest spots of the economy right now. For the past 8 years, every year, the share of private consumption to GDP has been increasing by almost 1%. Now it's roughly 47%. By 2020, it should be around 51, 52%. And last year, 63% of the GDP growth came from increases in private consumption. That's already going on. The reason why, very, very simple, because wage rates are increasing. Why wage rates are increasing? Because of relative labor shortage.
I think we'll have to leave it there. Wei, David, Michael, thank you so much. This was an excellent panel. I feel very enlightened about the future prospects of China just from our brief conversation. Thank you very much. Please join me.
Thank you.
And thanking them.